Chung-In asked me to sort of share my latest thoughts about the North Korea nuclear situation. And so I thought I would do that. And for today's lecture, I thought maybe the best way to approach this is to see, now knowing what we know in 2019, can we look backwards and try to assess what were the key decision points in North Korea's nuclear program, both from American side and also from a North Korean side. And so that's the approach to my discussion today. So let me start with what I think is the most recent and perhaps one of the most important key decision points. And it's what happened, or perhaps didn't happen, in Hanoi. So here is a photo of the Hanoi Summit. So here was Hanoi, and as you well know, even though the camaraderie was still there between President Trump and Chairman Kim, they walked away. And the Americans, had one particular story for why they walked away. But it turns out it was very different than the North Korean story. They had a very different story. They said, no, we didn't ask for all sanctions relief, and we were willing to give up a lot. By that time, it was too late. So the two countries had different stories. They walked away. And in fact, what was curious is the reception on the United States side. And this was one of the few times when President Trump received sort of plaudits from both the left and the right in the United States, and it was, Trump was right to walk away. No deal was better than a bad deal. But the question that I'm here to address today, was he really right to walk away? Was it a good decision, or was it what my colleague Bob Calvin and I call a hinge point? And a hinge point is sort of a decisive point, and it's usually, as we look back, it's where bad decisions have bad consequences. And so that's what I want to examine. So how much was Hanoi not just the right decision, but it was rather a hinge point? But as I think most of you know, I'm a technical person, not a diplomat, and I happen to think that the technical details matter. So if we going to assess, was President Trump correct walking away from Hanoi, you have to understand what Hanoi was all about, technically from a nuclear standpoint, and of course politically. And so what I've tried to do is to integrate those two, make sure we look both at the technical issues as well as the political issues. And so the one thing that I try to teach my students when we talk about nuclear weapons is don't just say nuclear weapons or nukes. Really think about what does it take to have a nuclear arsenal? And some of you have seen me present this before, but it takes three things. One, it takes the bomb fuel, the nuclear fuel, and that is for what we call fission bombs, the sort that we used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That would mean highly enriched uranium and plutonium. If you want to make a hydrogen bomb, which is significantly more powerful than an atomic bomb, then you also need forms of hydrogen. So it turns out this, for particularly a country that's starting a nuclear weapons program, is the most difficult because it takes a lot to make plutonium. You have to make it in a reactor. So that means you got to build a reactor and go ahead and run the reactor, and then you have to extract the plutonium in what we call reprocessing. So those are huge enterprises, and it takes a lot of people and a lot of money to do so. And then tritium, you also need a reactor to make tritium, so that's also quite an operation. So first of all, you need the bomb fuel. And then second, weaponization. And what I mean by that is to design, to build, and to test a nuclear weapon. And that requires all the things that I have on here, from understanding physics, computers, high explosives, all the way down to nuclear testing. So that's also a very important part. And then, if it's going to be a nuclear arsenal, you have to be able to deliver it. And so that then requires a delivery system. And, quite clearly, North Korea has focused on missiles. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were B-29 plane. So those are the important things. And as I point out in the top line, the bomb fuel, how much you have, in the case of North Korea, it would govern how many bombs they have. In other words, the size of the arsenal. The weaponization, particularly the nuclear testing part, is that governs the sophistication. So in other words, do they really have a fission bomb, or is it a fusion, namely hydrogen bomb? And then the missile, the delivery system, it governs how threatening the nuclear arsenal is. So if they can put it on a missile and be able to reach South Korea or Japan, in minutes, or the United States in 20, 30 minutes, that governs as to who is threatened. So that's what one needs to understand. And so whenever I look at the North Korean nuclear program, I look at all three of those. And then, however, if anybody tells you North Korea has X number of nuclear weapons, the first thing you should ask is, how do you know? Especially with a country like North Korea. It's not easy to look inside, and at least from what I know, we don't have anybody inside. And so the question, how do we know, and how confident are we in any of these estimates? It's important to recognize that, because only then can we really have a good assessment. So the way we know, let me just go through that very quickly, is of course in today's world it's overhead satellite imagery. That used to be only the purview of the intelligence agencies, but today you can do that with open source, publicly available satellites. North Korea is the most watched place in the entire Earth, and so there's lots of that satellite imagery. And here's just a case of satellites watching the building of what we call the experimental light water reactor in Yongbyon. And it was right here in November of 2010 that's when I saw that reactor actually coming out of the ground. And it was only after I was there that then satellite imagery said, oh yes, they're starting to build a reactor. And then you can watch them, so you can watch them over the years, and then you can see when the reactor was done on the outside. However, now we are in 2019, and it doesn't look like that reactor has operated as yet. Maybe getting very close. So we don't know why. It was finished outside in December of 2013, clearly finished, but yet it's not operating. So you'd like to be on the inside. Well, it turns out, for reasons that Professor Moon mentioned, so I've been there in North Korea, and so they've invited me in to see their nuclear facilities. In this particular visit, I was actually visiting their plutonium laboratories. And as you might imagine, from visiting those facilities, and then talking to their technical people, you learn a lot. Not just what they're telling you, but what they're actually capable of doing. So in my case, then, when I put together my estimates, I try to use all the knowledge that I have from being in the nuclear business for more than 50 years, and then also having visited North Korea. It's still, as I will tell you, there's still great uncertainties, but at least it gives you a little bit better idea. And then, lo and behold, this is quite strange, the North Koreans actually show you a lot. Okay, they show Kim Jong-un, and before him Kim Jong-il, going to these various missile and nuclear places, and you learn a lot from what you see. Of course, you don't believe everything that they show you, but nevertheless, it tells you a lot. And here is Kim Jong-un presumably inspecting a miniaturized nuclear warhead back in 2016. Okay, so now to give you a sense as to looking back at these key decision points, rather than picking out a particular year or a particular event or what one might call, what I often call provocations by the North Koreans, I don't think those are provocations. It's a story of the entire evolution of that nuclear program. And my colleagues and I at Stanford have done this. And what we did, and I know this is somewhat difficult to read, but if you look here from 1992 up through 2017, we year by year followed the evolution of their program. So we looked at things like diplomatic efforts by the United States, by North Korea. We looked at whether those diplomatic efforts actually resulted in having technical people on the ground in Yongbyon. In other words, was the diplomacy close enough that you actually had Americans or IAE inspectors in Yongbyon? It turns out that's very important, so we tracked that. And then we did this, what I just showed you, all the three phases of nuclear weapons. We tracked, did they make plutonium, uranium enrichment? Did they make the hydrogen bomb fuels like tritium? Did they weaponize, design, build, test, and summarize those and then look at the missiles? So we did that, and each one of those boxes we have a long narrative, and we explain what happened. So it's like 100 pages, but we know that at least in Washington, I don't know if it's the same way in Seoul, but people in our capital don't read 100 pages. In fact, they don't often read one page. And so we came up with the thought that, well, maybe we can track this in a visual way with colors. And so we said, well, let's color the activities that happen green if they're good from an American perspective. And the darker the green, the better. 3 shades of green. And then if they're bad, we'll make them red. The worse, the more deeper the red. So I won't take you at this point through all of those, but I'm just going to give you the mosaic of the results. Okay, here they are. So here's the mosaic, and what it shows, and by the way, the white lines here that go across are the different presidents coming in on the United States side. So these are 5 presidents. End of George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and then Trump coming in. And so what you see here is during the Clinton time, there was a lot of diplomacy. And of course, those of you who've been tracking North Korea for a long time, you know that. There was a lot of diplomacy. And as far as plutonium goes, it was very good. They actually backed off and stopped the plutonium production. They let 2 big reactors die altogether. Those were really important advantages. In terms of uranium enrichment, what you actually found was initially they didn't do much damage, but then they did start in 1997 or so, look more closely at the potential of uranium enrichment. And then you can see in terms of weaponizing, even while there was diplomacy, they never, in our opinion, they never sent their weapons designers home. They didn't just stop thinking about nuclear weapons. They sort of kept a hedge, just in case they would need this. And then in terms of the summary, you can see things are pretty good as far as for most of those years. And as far as missiles, yes, of course they were working on missiles, short-range missiles. They were selling missiles, actually. But then they had a moratorium as part of the agreed framework, which came in 1994. So then came President George W. Bush, and he and his team did not like the agreed framework. They said it was the worst deal ever made. Sounds familiar when one listens about the Iran deal. And so they cut the diplomacy. So diplomacy went from green to red, and it took only a little while before then North Korea reestablished its plutonium capabilities. They continued uranium enrichment. They started to make some tritium, at least so we think, and then weaponization, they became serious about building the bomb, and they did. And then eventually, in terms of the summary, in 2006, they actually tested the bomb for the first time. This one didn't work so well, but they tested. Okay, then President Bush, in the last 2 years, he did some diplomacy. That's when Ambassador Chris Hill spent a lot of time with the North Korean. And so that turned things back a little bit, but it sort of never stopped. It turned it from dark red, to light red. And then President Obama came in, and one would have thought, with President Obama wanting to reach out his hands, if somebody unclenched their fist, that it would have gotten better, but it didn't. And so then things turned more and more red. Then in comes President Trump, for those of you who can see the last line, and then everything turned red during President Trump's first year. So that's sort of the mosaic of what their program actually was. Not just what you think by going in and picking one box out of this whole. So that's what we then use to try to understand the program. So the bottom line of all of that, then by the end of 2017, so after President Trump's first year, we think this is sort of the best estimate. The plutonium, 20 to 40 kilograms, it only takes 5 or so kilograms to make a bomb. But it's not a huge amount. The highly enriched uranium, in spite of the fact that I saw their facility, I said already when I visited in 2010, it's clear when I saw that facility, they have to have another facility someplace else. And we don't know exactly where it is. There are various reports. But it's important to keep in mind that this is highly uncertain. So this is our guess. And tritium, the hydrogen bomb fuel, very limited, we think. Nuclear devices at that time may maybe enough nuclear materials for 25 to 30. Again, highly uncertain. Can they deliver those nuclear warheads on a short-range missile, the Scud or the Nodon, the medium range? I have to come to the conclusion at this point, I think the answer is yes. So in other words, they can most likely reach all of South Korea and most of Japan, based on the fact that they've done many of those short-range tests and that they've done enough nuclear tests that they should be able to miniaturize. However, when it comes to ICBMs or intermediate range, my own view is no, they have not done enough missile tests, they've not done enough nuclear tests, and unless they go back and do more, they can't yet put a warhead on an ICBM that is militarily effective. And so that's important to remember. So if you want to judge as to what North Korea has done or has not done since the Singapore summit, you have to understand where we are. And again, this is only my estimate, because in the end, we don't know for sure. But that's a pretty bad story, isn't it? I mean, they have plutonium, they have uranium, they have some tritium, they have these bombs, they can deliver them. How could this happen? How, with the whole world watching, how could this happen? Well, one thing, the Kims were determined to do nuclear things, all the way from Kim Il-sung through Kim Jong-il through Kim Jong-un. And it just gives you a little bit of a timeline as to best that we can figure out. But this isn't just Kim Jong-un doing this. I mean, it's a history of all three Kims. They've been incredibly successful. They got their start initially with the Soviets' atoms for peace. But Soviets told them, don't you dare build a bomb. But they gave them help with civilian nuclear. And then the North Koreans indigenously trained their people, did a lot of work. And so what you have to respect is their competence in the nuclear field and their persistence. That's what I found out. Of course, persistence is a particularly Korean characteristic, whether you're south or north, whether it's on the golf course or in the nuclear business. So they've done a lot of this, and they've been determined and deliberate in the pursuit of that arsenal. So now let's look at it from the standpoint of the Kims. So now the blue lines show the various Kim dynasties, from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. And then you can also see, as I showed before, when the nuclear tests actually happened. And there's 6 of them altogether. So the one thing we have to remember is the Kims were determined. They were willing to engage in diplomacy, but they never left themselves without an option. In other words, without a hedge. And that's the way that I interpret the colors. And that's what we have to understand. So now, in terms of key decision points, let me go back to U.S. key decision points, the things that we call hinge points. So a most critical decision point was between the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. So in other words, up here in 2000. And it actually happened, in effect, in October of 2002 with the visit of James Kelly to Pyongyang. But in essence, the Bush administration decided that agreed framework was a bad deal, and indeed they were able to destroy that deal. And the reason that they used was the fact that North Korea was clandestinely enriching uranium while it was indeed freezing the Yongbyon plutonium facilities. Well, it turns out the Clinton administration actually also knew that. And you can see I've colored this as sort of a light red. They were watching, and they knew the North Koreans were doing some things in order to try to build up its nuclear uranium enrichment capabilities. The Clinton administration decided to take advantage of the plutonium freeze and deal with the uranium later. The Bush administration did not want to do that, and so they used that as sort of, as some have said, the hammer to smash the agreed framework. And it was smashed. And then you can see what happened. When it was smashed, how things went red, including that first nuclear test. So that was a hinge point. It was an unfortunate decision where essentially a U.S. administration threw away a deal that, even if North Korea was developing uranium enrichment and had gotten better, it would take a decade before they could build a bomb. And instead, they were able to build a bomb within a year, because they have plutonium in the spent fuel pool. They were able to bring that out, extract it, and build the bomb, and then test the bomb, here. So that's what I consider a bad decision, a hinge point. And then, of course, as you go on, and President Obama then tries his hand, and I will explain this from the North Korean side in a minute. There were things on the North Korean side where I think they believed they had to proceed with a second nuclear test because the first one did not work well. So they had to convince themselves, the technical people, they had to convince the military, they had to convince Kim Jong-il, and they had to convince the world. And so they did do a second nuclear test. When they did that, Obama administration really never recovered. By 2012, though, the North Koreans, this was actually set up initially still by Kim Jong-il, but he died in December 2011. He was taken over by his young son, is to do what was called the Leap Day deal, where they actually agreed that even though the inspectors had been thrown out of Yongbyon back here in early 2009, that they would let them back in, and they would stop making plutonium, and they would even show their uranium enrichment facilities, which I saw in 2010. But Obama administration rejected that deal because the North Koreans launched a satellite, and there was a misunderstanding, or I think an intentional misunderstanding, where the Americans said no missiles, no rockets, nothing, and the North Koreans said no, we can do rockets. Lots of countries do rockets. They went ahead and proceeded, and then things went badly. So again, this was a decision by the United States at that time to say, no, we don't want the space launch, and therefore we're going to stop. And they did. 2015 was another attempt by Kim Jong-un in January when he said, I'm willing to do a nuclear testing moratorium. Obama administration dismissed that immediately. And what happened after that? What happened after that was a whole flurry of nuclear tests that were really crucial to their arsenal. So again, it was a questionable decision. But let me spend time actually on what about the North Korean side. And this is the trickiest part of my presentation, because in the end, I don't really know how the North Koreans thought, what made them do what they did. But what I do now is having this color chart, knowing what happened after various times and decisions, you can go back and say, well, I think that's what actually happened. And that's sort of what my story is here. So big decision was in 1991-92, and you're well familiar with that. North and South got together, signed a joint statement, and where Kim Il-sung, for various reasons, including, of course, Soviet Union collapsing, China actually, signing an agreement that they would work with South Korea, his world just fell apart, and he decided, at least from the best I can understand, maybe the Americans aren't so bad after all, and so started talking with the Americans late in that period of late 1980s, early 1990s, and eventually in 1994 then came the agreed framework. So that's what I'm going to show here, and if you keep your eye on the year. So that was one of the key decision points by North Korea. The next key decision point was in 1994 when Kim Il-sung decided they would actually try to get an agreement with the Americans. Of course, he died before the October agreement it's really not an agreement, and it's a framework, so the agreed framework in 1994. Then the next decision point was likely around 1997, when I believe the North Koreans were starting to think, we're not sure the Americans are actually going to come through with their part of this, because we had a lot of our congressmen and women were very much against the agreed framework, and that is the Republicans that came in the 1994 election, and so the Americans were somewhat slow in keeping up their part of the agreed framework. I won't repeat all of the details of that, but it's to build 2 light water reactors in conjunction with South Korea and Japan, and the North Koreans to shut down their plutonium program. However, at that point, I believe they decided it's better to hedge, and so they increased their uranium enrichment activities throughout the rest of the Clinton administration. Again, they didn't send their nuclear weapons designers home, and so they kept that option open. Okay, then the next key decision point is indeed October 2002, 2003, when the Americans actually did walk away from the agreed framework, and the North Koreans at that point, that decision point was, we're going to build the bomb. And they did. They took the plutonium that had been sitting since 1994 in the spent fuel pool, took it out, reprocessed it, and built the bomb sometime in 2003, early 2004, when the Bush administration still was not terribly interested in talking with the North Koreans. Then they find, first, before that time, the North Koreans actually had agreed in 2005, in September 19, 2005, to sign the joint statement. This was part of the six-party talks. And so the joint statement was signed. It was quite frankly, a very simple document, but had great potential. At the same time, though, the Americans then issued the Banco Delta Asia sanctions. So one part of the government signed an agreement, another part of the government sanctioned, and the North Koreans walked away. So they decided at that point, no, they're going to walk away, and that led eventually to this nuclear test in 2006. And the nuclear test is a big deal, even though it didn't work that well. It was somewhere around a kiloton. Hiroshima was maybe 15 kilotons, Nagasaki 21. So I mean, something went wrong. But once you get a kiloton, that means you know how to make fission bomb at least start. And so to me, it was clear they would be able to manage it, but they had to test again. And so that was the decision that was made at that time. The next decision point then was in 2008. It's probably my most controversial observation. My own view is that in spite of the fact that North Koreans and the Bush administration were actually talking with each other and making some progress. By late 2008, the North Koreans made a decision they're going to proceed full speed with their nuclear program. And sort of the best that I can understand that is Kim Jong-il had a stroke in August of 2008. And so there was a big question as to what happens with succession. There's a big question actually into how do you keep the military on one side, and so they did not want to look weak. And I believe they made a decision already in late 2008 that they're going to really go full speed. And if you look at the nuclear program, you can see how things went red. They did another test in 2009, and that one, let's say, it worked, and things turned red. So they made the decision here that unfortunately it's right at the time that President Obama comes into office. They do the rocket launch and they do a nuclear test, and it essentially set the stage for the next 8 years in the Obama administration. So around then, the time of 2012, they did this leap day deal where at least what they showed is they were willing to sort of test diplomacy again. I'm not sure they'd necessarily actually come to full agreement, but at least to test the diplomacy. And since that was rejected, they continued to proceed, and things get red and red. 2015, they make a test, and it was rejected, and things can turn more and more red, including these two nuclear tests in 2016. Those were very important. In my opinion, one of them was sort of a proof test for a hydrogen bomb. The other was most likely a proof test for a miniaturized bomb. And then comes President Trump. And so now there was another decision point, at least again the best that I can sort of put it together from the back end, is then by late 2017, 2018, they made the decision that they had demonstrated they have an ICBM range rocket. They had demonstrated that they most likely can make a hydrogen bomb with the September 3rd tests in 2017. And you have President Moon here in South Korea who reaches across. You have the Olympics coming up, and Kim Jong-un decides that they're going to participate in the Olympics, has a summit with President Moon, winds up with a summit with President Trump, and things change dramatically. So that's where we were, 2018. And here they are. In Singapore at the 2018 summit. A lot of people have criticized that for not amounting to much. To me, it was a watershed. It was an extremely important event because, as I show here, in 2017, everything turned red, dark red. 2017 was a dangerous, dangerous time on the Korean Peninsula. And the Singapore Summit, for whatever the substance was, walked away from that precipice of war. So it was a key decision to make. And President Trump, to his credit, was willing to meet. And then, we come to Hanoi, and of course there was a lot of time between June of 2012 and end of February of 2018, and unfortunately not much happened in that time frame. So in terms of decision points and strategy, it would seem to me from the North Korean side, they for the most part didn't want to talk. And that made it extremely difficult then for the Americans to follow up. And of course, on the American side, there were still many different opinions, within the Trump administration itself, and certainly across the whole government. So we wind up with Hanoi, and then we wind up in April 2019 with sort of an update of here. So they have a little more plutonium because they were making plutonium up into 2018 and most likely extracted some in 2018. So they have a few more nuclear devices. Situation here is the same. They can deliver a nuclear warhead to South Korea and to Japan, and still not militarily useful in terms of ICBMs. So, but the question then is Hanoi another hinge point? Things could indeed get worse if they indeed perfect those capabilities. And what the North Koreans have shown time and time again, what that chart shows, they are resourceful. And if they stop, once they get started, they'll get there. And so you sort of have to assume they're going to be able to do all of these things if they're left to their own devices. So then President Trump, since not much happened, after Hanoi either, and particularly after Hanoi, from the best I understand, North Koreans didn't answer the phone to the United States. And so it took President Trump, while he was over here, to go up to the DMZ, to Panmunjom, step across the divide, and perhaps jumpstart this activity again. And so now, if I then take this and update it to September 2019, again, not much has changed. However, what's happened in the meantime is the North Koreans from September of 2017 have done no more nuclear tests. And actually they've made it more difficult for them to go back to testing by disabling, partially dismantling the nuclear test center. They have not done an intermediate or long-range ICBM test. Those, again, if you look back at my chart of the three things, those are crucial to have a militarily useful hydrogen bomb, a militarily useful ICBM deliverable bomb, and they have not done that. However, absent an agreement from any of those, they continue to run the centrifuges, the best as we can tell. So the centrifuges in Yongbyon and whatever the other site is, we assume, and that's what I assume here. So they keep making highly enriched uranium. Maybe, again, best estimate is maybe 150 kilograms a year, or sort of 6 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium. But it turns out plutonium is much more important for sophisticated weapons, and they have not operated their reactor since sometime in 2018. So right now they're not making more plutonium. I don't think it's for political reasons. I think they're dealing with some technical issues, such as cooling for the old reactor, what we call the 5 megawatt reactor, and trying to bring the new reactor online. And so we see lots of activity going on in Yongbyon, but they're not making a lot. But they're making highly enriched uranium. But they're not making progress on the big things. However, as you well know, now since May, they broke a 522 timeline of not having done any missile tests. And they've now done sort of 10 batteries of either short-range ballistic missiles or these multiple rocket launchers. And that's what they've done, including a solid propellant missile that's called more or less the KN-23. So since May, they have made progress on these solid propellant short range. And as I'll show you in a minute, That's one of the things that I had hoped we could stop in North Korea. So it's not good for them to go ahead and do this, because it makes those missiles much quicker to use, and it's going to teach them how to do the first stage of an ICBM with a solid fuel. And so you'd rather not have them do that. It doesn't change, in my opinion, the military balance at this point, but it's directions that I wouldn't have wanted them to go. Okay, so what is the situation? You know, here we are, post-Hanoi, post-Panmunjom, and we're still not making progress, although the last week or so has shown some signs, so maybe something loosening up. But as I try to assess, so why can't we go ahead and sort of get over that threshold and make more progress? I tried to capture in these next two slides, and that is, so the American posture is that President Trump has decided that he would move with North Korea towards what I call non-hostile relations. And those of you who've dealt with North Korea, you know that has been their primary complaint about Americans and their hostile relations. Well, President Trump, clearly, from what he's done with Kim Jong-un, that's not hostile. You know, it's close to their friendship, at least at the top level. So that's good, and that's what moved us away from the precipice of war. So that's good. But then our policy has also been, you combine that with maximum pressure. So you combine non-hostile relations with maximum pressure. Maximum pressure would be some form of the joint military exercises. Probably more so yet from the North Korean. Maybe they worry more about the F-35A fighter being delivered to South Korea. But it's that combination, some sort of military push, and then mostly it's sanctions. So maximum pressure. So deep in the American psyche is the fact that if you're going to get a country to change its way, you have to squeeze it, and you have to do maximum pressure. You've heard that term with respect to Iran a lot in the last year, so it's maximum pressure. So that's what the Americans do. That's my view. So on one hand, definitely the president has shown he would like a deal. He would like to move back even further from the precipice of war. But the overall establishment believes you have to do that by at the same time sanctioning them. So as I would look at that from a North Korean side, I said, well, look, if you're going to do non-hostile relations, that's not consistent, with maximum pressure. You can't do both. You have non-hostile or you have maximum pressure. So the North Koreans then respond, and again, let me caution that I really don't know. You know North Korea much better than I do. The way the North Koreans respond is with a similar approach, and that is, yes, non-hostile relations, friendship, and I know you've seen the latest stamp, from North Korea with President Trump and Kim Jong-un and Panmunjom. So here they are. So this shows a friendship, a relationship with the Americans. So it's non-hostile to the Americans at the highest level. However, they're going to counter maximum pressure with maximum military readiness. So if things don't go well on this friendship end, we have to make sure we can defend ourselves. And so that's the way that I would view, these latest rocket and missile tests. They're going to make sure, or even the threat of a submarine. Quite frankly, I'm not worried about their submarine, but they show the submarine, so it's all there. This shows both internally and to the world, hey, look, we're going to be ready. If something goes bad, we're going to be ready. So I think friendship or non-hostile relations plus maximum pressure begets non-hostile relations with maximum military preparedness. So the issue is going to be who's going to make the next move to get us out of that relationship. So I'm drawing close to the end, and I'll just say from my standpoint, what's most important now at this point? First, still, we have to address and manage the security risk. No nuclear war. In fact, no war, because once both sides, American side, North Korean side, have nuclear weapons, war can easily lead to nuclear war, and that's what we have to avoid. So no nuclear war. But also, no nuclear conflict. Second part is no nuclear accidents. Those would be disastrous in an area as highly populated as Northeast Asia. No theft, making sure that whatever they have is actually secure. And no sale or export, by the government or by the military. Those are the things that are first and foremost on my mind. But then also no nukes. Indeed, denuclearization. But for that, we must create the conditions which will take trust and time. There's no single sheet of paper, in my opinion, that's going to convince the North Koreans that everything's going to be okay if they do denuclearize. So it's going to be a process that's going to take time. And then if they're going to denuclearize, we have to normalize. So that's what the Singapore statement said. Actually, only one of the 4 parts of that statement was denuclearization. The other 3 were aimed in the direction of normalization. You got to do both. You can't just insist on one. So, for that then, the most immediate next steps, to me, on that first part, is indeed Yongbyon. Dismantle Yongbyon first. I must say that Yongbyon is a big deal. The most important part over here is no nuclear test. No nuclear test. It's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to have a hydrogen bomb. It's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to miniaturize these for those missiles. And then over here, again, particularly as far as ICBMs, is no missile tests. So that would be the focus of my approach. And of course, they've already said no nuclear tests. They've done no nuclear tests since September 3rd, 2017. They've done no long-range missile tests since November 29th of 2017. In fact, for 522 days, they didn't do any missile tests until May of this year. So going in with that sort of approach would at least give you a way to phase things. And then, of course, one of the big controversies coming out of Hanoi, when from the best that I understand, when the North Koreans offered up to close down Yongbyon, is they didn't specify until the very end, and presumably when it's already too late, that Yongbyon actually means all of Yongbyon, everything in Yongbyon. And everything in Yongbyon is huge. It's a huge deal. It's the enterprise that really governs that first part. It's governing the size of their arsenal. And for those who call it an old, outdated, facility, forget it. Those facilities are all newer than most of the facilities in my home place at Los Alamos, New Mexico. The latest plutonium facility that we built was 1978. Their reactor didn't even start until 1986. And if you watch, you can see they continue. New buildings, new dams on the river, new cooling capability. They're continuously working on this place. They're working on tritium extraction facilities. This place is up and running. For them to shut this whole thing down is a huge step. Now, as people criticize, it doesn't mean they get rid of even a single nuclear weapon. That's true, because the nuclear weapons are not in Yongbyon. It doesn't mean that they can continue to design nuclear weapons. That's true, because we can't control their computers from Yongbyon. And it doesn't mean that they can make no more highly enriched uranium, because they have another facility someplace. They can make some, but they can't make plutonium. They can't make tritium. So you have to put all of those sort of into a risk formula. And to me, at this point, they shut down Yongbyon first. That's a big step. So we laid out already, just before the Singapore Summit, my colleagues and I, Bob Carlin, Elliot Serban and I, laid out, so what does it take to denuclearize? So much in the same way that I just showed you of what it takes for nuclear assets. So from the weapons to the personnel, to nuclear tests, to missile tests, to plutonium, the hydrogen fuels, uranium, and no export. So we lay all of those out. Those are the things that it takes. And then right after we showed that, it was indeed part of the administration that said North Korea has to do the Libya model. Okay, the Libya model means you get rid of everything right away. The CVID, as it was called at that time, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement. Everything goes. But we said, that's not possible. They're not going to do that. So why put your effort into that if that's a negotiation? It just doesn't work. It requires declaration and elimination. They're not going to do that right away. It's equivalent to a full-out surrender. They're not ready to surrender. Instead, take steps. And so what we laid out, instead of the red, we said, look, there are some things that you can manage. And so we color those in yellow and say, so don't ask for everything in red right away. We can manage these yellow things. And that will take time. So what we said, instead of the one-time Libya model, is focus first to halt. In other words, don't let it get worse. So we said at that time, so take a year, and they could make sure that it would halt. And then roll back. So don't just say you're going to stop, but actually make specific moves to roll back the program. And then eventually focus on elimination. And we said we don't know how long it's going to take, but a good guess was sort of 1 year for this, 2 to 5, and then up to 10 years. And in that time, if you take those steps and go down, you can build up the trust on each side in order to get to where you want to go. And in the end, what's left in red means all of the things in red are those that directly would help their nuclear weapons program. You can't do those. You've got to get rid of the red. So in other words, the weapons, they got to go. So this isn't a question of saying North Korea will remain a nuclear weapons state. No, they can't have nuclear weapons. Otherwise, I don't see how we can come to an agreement. But it's going to take time, to get there. And then some of the other things like, is it possible for North Korea to do a space launch? Well, I would say that may indeed be possible. Because whereas space launch in 1998, 2006 would teach them a lot about missiles, today they know all that stuff about missiles already. The space launch doesn't help them anymore to do missiles for bombs. And so it's a different trade-off than you had before. So what I'm proposing is to say, look, you can do this. You can look at the risks that each of these steps would actually engender and then make the decision. And then we actually put words in all of these as to what it would take, to get there in that sort of a time frame. So we show what you have to decommission, what you'd have to eliminate, what you'd have to dismantle and decommission. And at the time, that was not very well accepted in Washington, because it would seem you're going to give these guys all that time for 10 years to keep the nuclear weapons. But if we had followed those, we'd be in the rollback stage for sure already by now, along a different path. So what's the hope now? And by the way, over here, for example, I said one of the most important thing is no nuclear test. Moratorium or suspend. They've done that. And then when you get to the missile test, we said no intermediate range or no ICBMs. But we also said no solid rocket motor tests. Those are the ones they did now, in May through August. So if one had followed this sort of a chart, maybe one wouldn't have gone to that step of the solid rocket motor test. But they did, so now they know more, so it's going to make this more complicated. Okay, so what are the chances today? Well, sort of the best, as you know, lots of things have happened in Washington the past few weeks' time, and Steve Biegun, the special representative, gave a very important speech at the University of Michigan on September 6th. And here's more or less what I tried to extract from his talk. And quite frankly, it's very encouraging. It's very encouraging. He in essence says, this is going to take some time. It is going to have to be phased. And they don't have to bear it all, and we don't have to bear it all. We have to go through this together. And the route to denuclearization is through normalization and peace. And that's exactly right. So in other words, you have to give. I haven't talked yet. What does North Korea get in return? Well, to me, the most important thing is you have to ask them. But if they don't answer the phone, then you can't ask them. And so Steve Biegun also says, they need to get it together and make sure that they can quickly agree to significant actions with the U.S. And they've not done that, now, essentially since Singapore, and certainly not since Hanoi. He says President Trump, continues to be committed to achieve these results. And so I think with that, hopefully, if one can actually get back to the negotiating table, take the sort of approach that I've indicated, where you do step-by-step, phased in both directions, make sure that you ask them what do they want. Hanoi, they featured the sanctions relief. Since Hanoi, they've said, no, we're not so interested in sanctions relief anymore. We have to address the security issues. Well, I've sort of said all along, you have to do both. I mean, if they don't feel secure, they're not going to go there regardless of how hard you squeeze them. So you have to tackle the security issues, and you have to talk to them to understand what will help. And then there has to be sanctions relief. And to me, the encouraging part there is, at least until a few months ago, the relationship between South and North appeared to be so good that that's really the place where the economic development has to take place, where all of those discussions as to what can be done in order to draw the North closer to the South through some form of tailored sanction relief in order to make progress that will help them on their side. So that's what I consider to be pretty meaningful, hopeful way forward. And I will stop, and Chung-Yin, you can come up, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.